Hello Netrunner fans and welcome to my review of Ghoda. This is the first data pack in the Mum-Bad cycle, which is the 5th overall cycle for Android Netrunner. In part 1 we're going to be looking at the runner cards that are in the pack, and part 2 we'll look at all the corp cards. The first card we're looking at is a new run event for Anarch. This is called Run Amok. It's 3 to play and it's 3 influence. It's a run type and it's sabotage. Make a run. When the run ends, trash one piece of ice that was rezzed during this run. Here's another take on Anarch's ability to destroy ice. We have a lot of that kind of stuff within Anarch, and a lot of it sees play. Obviously Parasite, one of the strongest cards, newly on the most wanted list. But we also have the Cutlery, which combines well with Eater, and we've seen newer ideas like Immolation Script. Now this thing, my main concern is that this is really expensive. 3 to play, that's going to be really expensive if you don't have something like prepaid or just some way to reduce its cost. And the main thing I'm concerned about here is that it's pretty easy to play around as the corp. Unlike the Cutlery or Immolation Script, the corp can just not res ice. So you can just make a run with this. If they don't res anything, you're not going to get this effect. So to me, it seems like the biggest thing that you're going to need for this card to work is some incentive where it's dangerous for the corp to not res the ice. So that might be something like Medium or like Nerve Agent, or just having some way that if you do successfully make the run, you're going to get a big advantage. I've seen a lot of people talking about Blue Sun Glacier as a deck that could come back. And this card seems kind of good against Blue Sun, since they're so often returning their res ice to hand, they might have fewer resed ice when you're making these runs. This is also pretty decent against remote servers that are just there to make money, because they're not necessarily going to want to trade a piece of ice to save that thing in a lot of situations. So I could see that being okay. That said, we haven't seen a whole lot of play out of things like the Cutlery or Immolation Script, and this to me seems like a much more expensive way to go about that. 3 cost, that's going to be really bad, and I think there's a lot of situations where the corp can just let you pay 3 plus whatever it costs to break ice to get into a server and just make a successful run. So this to me, it seems like it's going to require a lot of setup, it's really expensive, and if you're going to play this at all, it's probably going to be like a 1 or 2 of. Next up, we have a new piece of hardware for Anarch. This is Ramu John Reliant 550 BMI. Wow. It's 1 to play, it's 1 influence, it's consumer grade, which we'll talk about in a bit, that's a new one. It has trash. Prevent up to X net or brain damage. Trash cards from the top of your stack equal to the amount of damage prevented. X is the number of copies of this card installed, including the one you just trashed. And then it's limit 6 per deck. One of the biggest themes that we're going to see in this cycle, based on the spoiled cards, is new rules and new kind of variations on how we go about building a deck. We're going to see cards that break the influence rules, and in this case, we're seeing a card that breaks the number of copies per deck rule. I wanted to point out quickly that this consumer grade mechanic, this limit 6 per deck, you do get 6 copies of the card in the pack. So you're not going to have to buy 2 copies of the pack to be able to play all 6 of this. Although I do find it kind of lame that since we're getting 6 of this card, we're just not getting another new card. In other words, we're getting the same total number of cards in the pack that we would normally get in a pack, and since we're getting 6 of this one, we're not getting 3 of some other card. With that stuff out of the way, let's look at this card. Now, this is probably one of the best ways to prevent brain damage in the game, period. This could hypothetically prevent up to 6 brain damage in a go if you happen to have all of these installed. And there's hypothetically a few pretty okay ways to do that. I think Replicator is a pretty obvious way that we could get all 6 of these installed. With that said, who needs to prevent 6 brain damage? I could maybe see in certain matchups preventing a lot of net damage being decent, but in general, I'm pretty lukewarm on this ability. It seems to me like we're going to need more runner cards that do brain damage to you in order for this to be good. As it is now, we don't really have anything that does that amount of brain damage where we would really want to spend all this time getting this thing set up. Not to mention all the best effects that we have that do brain damage say it can't be prevented. There might be a few advantages to this just being consumer grade, especially if we get some more consumer grade cards. The first thing I thought of was Page Piper, which would allow us to install one of these and then search the rest of our deck for the other 5. That might be a pretty good way to thin a bunch of garbage out of our deck, with the obvious disadvantage being you have to play a bunch of garbage in your deck. For now, it's pretty obvious to me that this is going to be sitting in the box. I think maybe in the future, if we see more consumer grade, or if there's some way to abuse Page Piper in an interesting way, maybe some sort of combo, this thing could come out of the box. But as it is, I don't see you wanting to play this sort of damage prevention thing, especially if you have to play 6 copies of it in your deck. The next card is a new resource for Anarch. It's called Street Magic. It's 0 to play, it's 1 influence, it's virtual. Unbroken subroutines resolve in the order of your choice. So this is obviously pretty cool. This is something we can't do with any other card, but that's all this card does. My initial reaction to this is that this card is pretty horrible. There are really not that many ice where the order of the subroutines matters. The one that I think a lot of people have pointed out is Little Engine. You would be able to gain the money from Little Engine with the last subroutine and then just run into the end the runs or break it or something like that. But that's really just not that good. Little Engine doesn't see that much play, and it's certainly not worth playing a card like this in your deck. I also could see this being reasonably okay against things that do damage or other nasty stuff. Usually if there's some anti-face check type effect, it's like nasty subroutine, then end the run subroutine. So if you wanted to face check a piece of ice like that, you could let the end the run fire and then you wouldn't have to take whatever the other effect was. This might also be interesting if there's a way in the future to add subroutines to ice. So like if we get something that adds like good subroutines, like the runner gains money or draws cards or something like that, if we have ways to add subroutines, I could maybe see this being a little bit better. But we don't really have that now. And as it is, this card is obviously terrible to me. It's really just not going to see any play. It's a cool effect, and I like that they're doing this sort of thing. But this to me seems like an effect that would be much more well-suited to be tacked on to some other card, like a console that did something else, like give you MU, and then also had this. I don't really see myself wanting to play this card just for this effect. Next up, we have a new event for Criminal. This is called High Stakes Job. It's 6 to play, it's 3 influence, it's a run type, and it's a job. Make a run on a server with at least 1 piece of unrezzed ice. When the run ends, gain 12 credits if it was successful. Like with Run Amok, I really like these when the run ends effects. I think that's an area of the timing space that hasn't been used enough. Now this is a pretty interesting card in the sense that it's a new economy tool that's really difficult to use. The first thing I thought of with this was Ken Tenma and using public terminals. The big thing about that is not only would this trigger Ken Tenma's ability, you'd get a credit for playing the run event, but you'd also get to reduce the cost of playing this if you had public terminals or maybe like prepaids, and that would make you get a lot more than just the +6 from getting through the ice. This is potentially a pretty good follow-up to Siphon, because if they don't have enough credits to res ice, it might be a lot safer to play this on a server with unresed ice. Or if you like emergency shut down one of their big ice and you know that they can't res something, this could maybe be okay. I don't know, this is really hard to use. It's so expensive, and I think if you don't have a way to reduce its cost, it's going to be just totally unplayable. It's pretty clumsy to use this even when you do have the public terminal thing going, and I'm really worried that this is the type of card where it's going to give you credits in a game state where you're already set up. This isn't going to help you early in the game where you need the credits the most. This is going to be more like a mid and late game card once you have a little bit of ice breaking going on, have some of a rig. This will help you get into certain servers and make some money. I'm not particularly impressed with this. I think Criminal already has plenty of decent burst economy effects. Bank Job and things like that are clearly superior to this. So I think this is really only going to be used in a very specific context, maybe in that Ken Tenma deck. Next up, we have a new icebreaker for criminals. Yay! It's called Mongoose. It's 3 to install, 1 MU, 2 influence, and it starts with 1 strength. It's an icebreaker killer. You cannot use Mongoose to break subroutines on more than 1 ice per run. It has credit, break up to 2 century subroutines. Then it has 2 credits plus 2 strength. This is maybe not the sexiest card ever printed, but I'm absolutely pumped about this thing. First of all, this is a new criminal icebreaker that doesn't suck. Right off the bat, we're looking at 3 to get through Architect. It has 1 strength, so it's going to be able to chew through something like Kamainu. This thing's pretty decent. And on top of that, we've got this, you can only use it to break 1 ice thing. I think that's a really awesome and really interesting and very dynamic thing to put on an icebreaker. And this is the way that I wish more icebreakers would look. The big thing about this is it encourages both sides of the game to play a little bit differently and to have some different tactics. If your opponent has a Mongoose in play, you can stack 2 sentries on 1 server, and that's going to require them to either have 2 Mongoose, I guess, or have another sentry breaker like a Fairy. I think Fairy plus this just looks like a great way for a ton of criminal decks to get through sentries. And I actually think this might see a little bit of play outside of criminal as well. This seems like a really awesome supplement to some of the AI breakers. Something like Faust. This addresses a lot of the big weaknesses that Faust has, like multi-subroutine sentries. It's also pretty good as a complement to Atman, because Atman at 4 is going to crush a lot of really good sentries, and this might be able to get you through the lower strength ones that you'd have more trouble with. Plus, I think the whole 3 to break on Architect is just huge. You're going to see things like Architect all over the place, and having this as a slightly less efficient than Mimic way to deal with that is super huge. I really, really like the design of this. I'm hoping that we get more of these limited icebreakers, and this is pretty much exactly what I like to see with icebreaker design. Next up, we have a new Shaper ID. This is Jesminder Sareen. She's the girl behind the curtain. She's a 45-15 like normal. She's got 0 link. She's a natural. Avoid the first tag during each run. This is certainly a lot different than a lot of other IDs we've seen. The first thing that I immediately thought with this is that this is really bad at dealing with a lot of corp card effects. A lot of the scariest tag things don't occur during a run, so really the only corp effects that you're going to be able to use this against are ice or maybe something like News Team. Now, that said, there's plenty of great things that we can use this against in terms of runner card effects. Obvious examples are Siphon and Vamp, but also maybe Code Siphon. And the card we're going to look at next is also another one of these gives you a tag penalty cards that this is going to help you mitigate. I like that they're doing this sort of exploration with design space on IDs. This certainly feels powerful to me, but I do think that it's going to be hard for this to compete with some of the other IDs within Shaper, especially Kate and maybe like Chaos Theory. I feel like those just have so easy to use abilities. They don't require you to build your deck in a funky way. So I don't know. I think that this card has some potential with like Siphon or Vamp, maybe Code Siphon, but I think we really need a few more in-faction effects that give you tags for this to go all the way to like tier 1. Next up, we have a new console for Shaper. This is Maya. It's 3 to play, it's 3 influence, it's unique as consoles are. It's hardware. Gives you +2 MU. Once per turn, immediately after you access a card from R&D, you may add that card to the bottom of R&D. If you do, take a tag, and it's limit 1 console per player as they all are. It's pretty easy to get excited about this R&D effect, but let's just pause for a second and consider that this is a 3 cost +2 MU hardware console. That alone is really solid, especially in Shaper, where we don't really have a lot of choices with console. It's pretty much we just play Astrolabe by default because it draws us a couple cards and it's cheap and it isn't terrible like most of the rest of the consoles. So this is going to immediately enter the Shaper card pool as a really, really solid choice competing with Astrolabe. If you need 2 MU, you're going to be willing to spend 3 on this. That's as cheap as 2 MU comes. And I think that this is just going to be really solid, if only for the reason that it's a cheap console that gives you 2 MU. Now this R&D effect is pretty neat. So for accessing multiple cards, especially on multiple runs, this is going to be nice. We're going to be able to look at a card on R&D. If it's something that we can't trash, we don't want the corp to have it, or we just want to see more cards the next time we run, we're going to be able to put one of those cards on the bottom of R&D. And I think that's going to be worth the tag, even in the decks that aren't playing the tag avoidance thing with Jesminder. It's worth pointing out that I've seen a lot of misconceptions about the timing with this card. You're not going to be able to use this like you would with Film Critic to avoid nasty on-access effects. So like if you access a snare, for example, you're going to have to get snared, deal with the snare, and then you can put the snare on the bottom if you don't want to trash it. This isn't going to help you avoid the nasty access effects. But I don't think that matters really. This is still pretty good. You're going to get to see more cards on R&D. You're going to get to basically trash, or at least put to the bottom, some card that you don't want the corp to get. And I think there's a lot of situations where that's going to be a pretty good effect. And like I said before, that's on top of this being just a really cheap, good way to get more MU. Next up, we have a new program for Shaper. This is Panchatantra. It's 2 to play, it's 1 MU, it's 2 influence. Once per turn, when you encounter a piece of ice, you may have it gain 1 subtype of your choice that is not Sentry, Code Gate, or Barrier for the remainder of this run. Here's kind of a back to their roots Shaper card. We haven't really seen things that give subtypes to ice for quite some time, and this is a pretty sweet way to do it. The obvious limitation here is that we can't give the basic subtypes, so we're not going to be able to just use our Fractor to cut through everything or something like that. So we're going to be looking at using some of the kind of subtypes, the ones that correspond to certain subroutines that the ice have. So for example, Sharpshooter only breaks Destroyer type, and that corresponds to ice that have Trash a Program subroutines. Within Shaper, we also have Deus Ex, which normally only breaks ice that have some kind of damage subroutine. So Panchatantra is going to let us use these otherwise very narrow icebreakers to break a much wider range of ice. And unfortunately with these, they both trash, so that's going to be a little harder to do. But this might be the card that brings out Gingerbread, which is a very, very seldom, if ever used, criminal icebreaker. Breaks only tracers, but if we can give any piece of ice the tracer subtype, Gingerbread's going to be a lot more powerful, given how efficient it is. Plus, it's worth pointing out that we're in a period of unprecedented tracer use. NBN's got all kinds of really, really great ice that are tracer, and Gingerbread's going to be pretty effective just at dealing with those. So I could maybe see this combo coming out in some kind of Shaper deck. This really reminds me of the way that Kit assigns the Code Gate subtype to things, both with her power as well as card effects. I think this is this very similar type of combo, but I think maybe this one even has the potential to be better because Gingerbread is really, really efficient, and putting it on something like Dinosaurus could make it really, really strong. I'm definitely going to be trying this out. I love this type of Shaper deck, And while I don't know how competitive this is going to be, this is cool and feels very, very Shaper to me. Next up, we have a new resource for Shaper. This is Artist Colony. It's 0 to install, it's 3 influence. It's a location. It has forfeit and agenda. Search your stack for a card and install it, paying the install cost. Shuffle your stack. This reminds me of Data Dealer. That's the obvious comparison here, forfeiting an agenda. But the big difference here is that this one doesn't cost a click, so we're going to be able to do it at any time at the end of the corpse turn, during a run, etc. That's going to make that kind of like self-modifying code in a way, except we can get resources or just any card with this. That's pretty cool. Now, forfeiting an agenda obviously sucks, but Shaper has more ways to mitigate that than any other faction. We have notoriety and fan site in faction. That's going to give us some ammo for this thing. Not to mention there's quite a few corp card effects that end up in our score area. So we're looking at things like News Team, ShiQ, or maybe just like a 1-point agenda. It's worth pointing out that Shaper already has a bunch of other tutors, but this one is by far the best if you don't consider the cost. It lets you get any card. It's going to let you install it as well. You'll be able to get the types of hoser cards that you won't be able to find with SMC. So I'm especially thinking of Plascrete and Film Critic. I'm not sure how competitive this card will be, but I do think there's a little bit to play around with maybe like fan sites out of Haley, and you'd be able to set all this stuff up quickly. I don't know, we'll see what happens with this card. This is definitely the type of thing that gets better if the metagame on the corpse side has a lot more ShiQs and news teams and things like that. And this seems like an okay addition to the Shaper card pool. The last runner card in the pack is a neutral resource. This is Chatterjee University. It's 1 to install, it's no influence, and it's unique. It's a location Ritzy. It has click, place a power counter on it. Then it has click, install a program from your grip, lowering the install cost by 1 for each power counter on it. Remove 1 hosted power counter. Here's a new neutral economy tool that's got some really serious limitations. The big problem with this is that the only way you can derive value from clicking it a whole bunch of times is if you have really expensive programs to install. So you're going to need to be playing not only quite a few programs, but it's going to be best if you have quite a few expensive programs. Now, luckily, there's lots of icebreakers that are in like the 4 and 5 range, but this to me seems like it's really not going to be worth including in your deck unless you play a whole lot of programs with costs. I could see maybe Anarch or Criminal using this as kind of a poor man's personal workshop that only works for programs. I definitely don't see Shaper playing this at all since you've got Personal Workshop and like Sahasrara and stuff like that. But maybe in kind of a big virus, playing lots and lots of programs deck out of Anarch, we could see this getting a little bit of value. That's going to do it for part 1 of my Ghoda review. Be sure to tune in to part 2 where we look at the corporation cards. There's lots of cool stuff over there. And if you liked the video, be sure to subscribe and press the button that looks like a thumbs up. I'll see you over in part 2.